It's 10 o'clock, top of the hour, so I think we can kick off the session. Welcome, David, and thanks for agreeing to speak at the Singapore Actuarial Conference again.
Nice to see you, Sanchit. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And for everyone, I'll do a very brief introduction. David actually needs no introduction to those who know him, but I've had the pleasure of knowing him for a few years. But David is the CEO of the Directors and Chief Risk Officers Institute, or the DCRO Institute. He's had a long career serving as a board member, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, and importantly for us, as a risk leader. David is author of a book called The Governance We Imagine: Organizational Design, Risk, and Value Creation, as well as the Board Member's Guide to Risk. And he will discuss the relationship between stakeholders, capital providers, the psychology of risk, and value creation. Is there actually math that explains this? Why does the way people react to risk vary? And what are the critical differences between feedback and feed forward when considering our ability to pursue our corporate goals? So with that very brief introduction, I don't want to eat into the precious time we have with David. So I'll hand over to David for his presentation. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Sanchit. Nice to see you again. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I appreciate joining you, and it's nice that we're able to do this virtually and see so many people that are online. I enjoyed the session before this, and as I look through the agenda of the items covered over the previous 2 days, Sanchit, I saw that you'd done your session on ESG, but there are a lot of different areas that were being discussed that I think were quite important, timely, relevant. And, as Sanchit had mentioned, I've been around this risk space for quite a while. I've actually been around actuaries for quite a while. Back in the early 1990s or mid 1990s, I actually worked with a couple of actuaries in an insurance company where we built the first firm-wide risk management program in the mortgage banking business. And so I can go back and schooled my undergraduate degrees in math and economics, and a lot of my my classmates are now actuaries. So it's a great profession. You guys have a lot of influence. And I hope what I talk about today is of interest to you, because while we use the word math in the introduction, I had to throw that in there. We're talking to actuaries. There has to be something about math in this, and there is some math in the presentation. But really what I'm going to show you and talk to you about today are about relationships, and the relationships between people, technologies, and starting to view the world as something that's living, or our organizations as living things. And I think that's a really important transition to make, because not all of this can be described by math, but there is a way to describe some of the human side of this that has mathematical equivalents in it and helps us to understand how the human condition influences the success of our organization. So let me share my slides with you now, and then we'll get started. Make sure I get the right one up there for you, Sanchit. And yeah, I think that's the right one. Okay, good. So as the title of the presentation tells you, we're talking about interconnectedness. And I think the reason I chose that word is when the description was given to me of the theme, the general theme of this conference, everything, everywhere, all at once, if I'm remembering that correctly. Interconnectedness is about that. It's about this simultaneity of our relationships with each other. It's about our relationships to each other in ways that we may not even be thinking about, or that we see, and our relationships to technologies that I think are even more difficult to see. I've written some articles recently on the challenge of seeing things as living beings when they're invisible to us in many ways. And AI systems, and a lot of the data that goes into AI systems right now, they're becoming living systems of which we're only a part. So it's important for us to start seeing organizations, our companies, this actuarial society, anything to which you belong to, as being a living entity, and how it helps to create value, or sometimes destroy value. So how we relate to these entities, that has to do with our perception of what they'll do for us and the risk of dealing with them. And it helps us lead, hopefully, to some level of corporate success. So the organization that I run, the DCRO Institute, works primarily with board members and C-suite executives. So we're very focused on the governing of our organizations as they take risk to achieve their goals. So I have 4 goals today for us in terms of our conversation. The first is kind of what I've spent most of the time talking about so far, is that our organizations are complex systems. And we're going to actually expand on that just a little bit. But we have high dependencies on other systems. And this is really an essential nature of understanding how economies work, how our companies can thrive and do well. We should recognize that we can't escape these dependencies. So if we recognize that, we can start to embrace those dependencies, and that our strategic decisions that we make, these things that have to look out 3, 5, 10 years in what are sometimes very difficult situations, they become more likely to create value when we incorporate the knowledge we can get from these dependencies, which is in essence inviting them to be part of what we do. And ultimately, what I want us to know is that trust is the central element to value creation. Now, trust might feel like this soft, squishy thing, and you might hear people throw the word around trust or reputation all the time. But what we're really looking at is central to our valuation. It plays a far bigger role in what you are worth as an individual to your company and what your company is worth to all the people who engage it than most of us realize. And that's where we'll get to some of the math. So this is what I'd like us to talk about or get to today, or some better understanding of this today. And I hope we have time for some questions at the end. So whenever I do a presentation, you'll always find me recommending books. I'm going to recommend 4 of them for you today. This book is almost always in my slide deck. It goes back, I want to say maybe to 2008, 2009. Eric Beinhocker is the author. The book's called The Origin of Wealth. It's a play on the origin of species, title of Darwin's. And what it looks at is the complexity of systems and complexity economics. And when I say in this slide that if you read this book, it'll change the way you see everything, I mean that. If you're not familiar with complexity science or complexity economics, and you read this book, you will have a whole different understanding of economics than you had before. I did my graduate degree in economics. My undergraduate degree is in math and stats and economics. When I read this book, it filled in the gaps from the knowledge I gained in my work and what I learned in school. And so I recommend this book for you. It's a long book with very small font, so you'll spend a lot of time reading it, but it'll be one of the most valuable exercises you can engage in terms of your work for your companies and also in terms of your career. So in this book, we talk about complex systems and how the interaction of what we call agents in these systems, which can be people, technologies, information, how those come together to create value, and also how those systems can collapse. And that's something that's important for us to understand too. So let me get to very basic relationships in these complex systems. What I have on the screen in front of you now is a relationship between 3 people. It's really the relationship between one person and 2 others. And these lines that you see connecting them, those are representations of trust or the value or the influence of that relationship. So the thicker the line, the more valuable the relationship. In this case, Agent A has a relationship with Agent B and Agent C, but Agent B and C have no relationship with each other. So Agent A is asking a question, in this case, a simple one, do I buy something or not? Because the line is thicker to Agent B has more influence over that decision. And so Agent B says, buy, you buy. Agent B says, don't buy, you don't buy. That's the influence that these agents have in this very simple system. Now, here's a little bit more complex system. And again, in this case, consider yourself to be Agent A, which is roughly in the middle of the diagram, a little bit to the lower left. Agent A here has relationships with only 4 different agents in this more complex system. But as you look around Agent A, there are relationships of varying degrees of influence that will ultimately influence Agent A through the 4 agents that Agent A has relationships with. And this is something that we might forget in dealing with our customers or dealing with all the people who interact with us. They interact with many others, and sometimes the influence they have over those others is greater than the influence we have over them. So our relationships are important beyond just the ones that are right in front of us. Now, I'm old, so this actor named Kevin Bacon is somebody who's very familiar to me. Maybe some of you know him, even though he's about my age. Kevin Bacon's a movie star, and there's this game that we play in the United States called 6 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon. As an actor, you try to name other actors, and in less than 6 steps, connect them back to Kevin Bacon. Well, as some of you know, because I'm sure some of you have played games similar to this, it's really not a hard game to win. The reason is, and this picture that you see in front of you, is that Kevin Bacon has a very extensive network. what you're seeing here on this screen is a very small subset of that network. And like in the slide that I showed you right before this, there are lots of people who have influence over the value of Kevin Bacon, let's say as an actor in this case, based on the information that's shared throughout this network, most of which Kevin will never hear. He'll only know because they don't go to his movies, or he'll only know because there are bad things being said about him in the press, or good things, hopefully. And hopefully people go to his movies. But his relationships in this case are often second and third order. And like I said, this is a very small portion of that network of people related and entities related to Kevin Bacon. You can do the same chart with your company. And again, it's a really, really small subset of all the relationships that your company has. Every one of those entities in this complex network is making a value judgment about the relationships that they have. So 2 more books I want to recommend to you, because this is where we start to get into the psychology of risk and how it influences the decisions we make about whether we're going to engage in relationships in these systems. The first book is called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. It's a very short book written by a neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett. One of the things that comes out of her book is this notion that our brains only exist to do 2 things: find energy and decide when to spend energy in search of that energy. That's it. We have these incredibly complex brains, but ultimately it's making those decisions. How do I find energy? When do I expend it? Okay, those are the decisions it's making. But that's not just our brain. It's actually any living system, any complex system is making those same decisions. Now, the book Deviate by Bo Lotto also looks at the way in which our brains work, and sometimes in a way that might make you uncomfortable, in part because what Bo Lotto talks about is our brains working on a probabilistic nature. Now, probabilities don't scare actuaries, but the notion that what you're taking in terms of information in your brains is only a probabilistic assessment of everything that is around you sometimes can be unsettling. We don't have the capacity to process every piece of information, every bit of information that's coming in through the senses in our bodies and our minds. So we have to use some sort of truncation of that information based on the memories that are there, the experiences we've had in the past. There may be genetic linking that comes and brings information to us in this. But our brains are far from perfect, and our brains are subject to all sorts of biases. And one of the things that we'll talk about here in a little bit is that our brains are trained to make quick decisions that aren't necessarily the best ones, but they're done for the sake of preserving energy and sometimes preserving life. We don't talk about that a lot in this next point in this presentation a lot, but one of the key findings in Lotto's work and in this book is that a diversity of brains trying to attack a problem actually does a much better job than any one individual brain. So it's a good argument for diversity in our boardrooms, diversity in our executive suites, and anywhere else that we're doing. So both of these books, there is much, much more to them than what I've just described here. So now any of you who are doing work in finance may know of a term called cash flow return on investment, CFROI. Anybody who has the CFA knows that. The gentleman you see pictured here is named Bart Madden. Bart was the one who created that measure, I think, back in the late 1960s. So it's been around for quite a while, as Bart's been around for quite a while. But Bart is still going strong, very sharp, very smart. Put out a book about 2 years ago called Value Creation Principles. Bart and I had a nice sit down in his house one day. I went to visit him. He had a copy of my book out with probably 30 or 40 Post-it notes in it, and I was worried he was going to rip it to shreds. But what it turned out was the way in which we were thinking about systems in our organizations was very much aligned. And Bart, and we're not going to talk about this in this presentation, but Bart talks in here about a cycle that corporations go through. And they go through it inevitably, where something they're doing that's valuable today becomes less valuable in the future. And there's a way to get around that. And this has to do, again, with these systems. So one of the things that I'm putting up on your screen here is a graphic from Bart's book. And this is a knowledge building loop. So what Bart looks at is the system of our organization, which begins with our purpose. We incorporate the worldview of our organization, which helps feed the perceptions that people have of us, which lead to actions and consequences for us and for the people who are involved with us, which gives us feedback, which we then reincorporate into our knowledge base, which then helps redefine our purpose, worldview, and everything that we do. This loop has to be happening over and over and over again in order for our organizations to thrive and survive. This is part of where we're starting to bring our network into the value creation of our organizations. Thus, Bart's named his book Value Creation Principles. I highly recommend all 4 of these books that I've mentioned to you today. I think they will all help you and all change the way you see some things. Math, look, I'm getting to math, close to math anyway. This is an illustration. The first book I wrote has 1 equation in it. It's the only equation, and like I said, it's more of an illustration. But this is what your brain is doing. Anytime your brain is considering an action, anytime your brain is considering spending energy in pursuit of more energy, it's asking 3 questions. What will I get? For how long or for how many times will I get it? And what's the chance I'm going to be disappointed? In other words, what's the chance that my expectations aren't met? So this illustration is on the top, these U's, U0 through U3, those represent utility or something useful. That's a good way to remember it. And the DRs on the bottom are discount rates. We'll get a little bit more mathematical on those in just a second. But that's where we're going to look at the chances of being disappointed. So this won't surprise you. If you're going to get more out of a relationship, or if you expect to get more out of a relationship, the value of that relationship goes up. Think about being a customer of a restaurant or an investor or somebody who, even a friendship. If you're going to get more out of that, you're going to be willing to pay more for it. Now, if you're going to get that more often for a longer period of time, you can think about this for those of you who work in fixed income. If you get more coupon payments back on a bond, it's worth more. And so our resiliency of our organizations helps to create higher value for them. And in this case, if the discount rates or the chance of being disappointed goes down, the value of our organization goes up. Good governance is about making those three things happen. Greater reward, we have higher resiliency, and less chance of disappointing all of those in our network. If we do those 3 things, we create very valuable organizations. And just quickly on the math on this, because I think some of you will understand this, or some of you will know this, be quite familiar with it. The origin of this view on risk perceptions and value creation goes back to this mortgage company that we helped build this firm-wide risk management program for, because much of the exercise of options that are embedded in mortgages, particularly in the United States, has to do with risk perception. They're not exercised efficiently. And so an organization that issues mortgages or services mortgages has to understand this inefficiency of the option and understand how it is that people are pricing a risk premium on top of the risk-free rate in order to come up with a value. So that illustration I gave to you before is a simplified version for mostly non-math people of an equation like this, where the discount rates are the risk-free rate plus some risk premium. And in every instance, every period of time, those are different numbers. So it's not a constant discount rate. Anytime anybody's using a constant discount rate over a period of time, stop them, tell them to go back, start working the discount rates out period by period, because that variation matters when you're coming to a true value, particularly of a complex derivative. Okay, so let me bring 4 ideas together here. We either create value or destroy value by the way in which we interact with those people and technologies and information in our networks. Those are people all deciding on where to expend and when to expend energy. We need energy as humans to continue living, but our organizations are living beings as well. They need energy, and I'll talk a little bit in a second here about the kind of energy that our organizations need. So our organizations have to find it and figure out how to use it as our primary actions. These memories that I talked about in Bo Lotto's book, or these experiences, These are already here in our brains, and our brains are complex systems, and our organizations are complex networks of lots of different brains. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the octopus or an octopus, but an octopus seems to have a different brain in each of its arms, and it has a controlling brain or a larger brain for the entire body. But the brain of an octopus arm can continue hunting, even if that arm is separated from the rest of the octopus. Our organizations are like that. We have a lot of different brains and resources that are all connected in this complex living system that is our company. And sharing information through Bart's knowledge building loop, like I had mentioned, can change our brains for the better as we bring in new information, as we respond to things that we learn, as we improve all of our processes, and we figure out how to better spend our energy and where to find it best. So let's get into some of this psychology of risk. This one you may be familiar with because the people who came up with this notion of framing, at least one of them won a Nobel Prize. The other one would have, but he had passed away before the time that the prize was awarded. But Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky are famous for this concept of framing. And this is something I talk to people who deal with their boards a lot about risk. When you change the framing of a conversation or a question and frame it in the negative as opposed to the positive, you get a very different response from people. And that's deeply ingrained in us. It's deeply ingrained in this notion about how we think about running away from things that are losses, or preserving energy is the way to think about it in terms of our brains. So one of the famous choices in these framing exercises is you're the director of public health and somebody says to you, there's a pandemic or there's a virus or something going through community, and you have a way to deal with it. The first choice will surely save 1/3 of the people, 200 out of the 600, but there's a 1/3 chance of saving everyone and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. When given this choice to people, even though they have the exact same expected value, 70% of people choose option one. But now we're going to change that. And we're going to say, if you do approach number one, 400 people will die. Or you can choose option two, and there's a 1/3 chance no one will die. 80% of people choose option two. All of these have the same expected value. If we were rational human beings, we wouldn't care. We'd say, oh, they're all the same to me, but we're not. We treat loss differently than we treat gain, or the prospect of loss in relation to the prospect for gain. Another thing that we need to be aware of, and this is particularly true if you're working on the capitalization of your organizations, which insurance companies, this is pretty important, is this notion of social amplification. If you haven't heard of this, SARF is the abbreviation for it, social amplification of risk framework. It was developed by a couple of different psychologists, Elke Weber, who was somebody who I was fortunate enough to meet one time, and Paul Slovic. And what they looked at was a question of why certain risks amplify and become much bigger than what the original loss was when others don't. How do they go through this network? How is it that people communicate about these potential losses, and what drives that? Well, what they found is there are two factors: the risk of the unknown, meaning how well do we understand something, and dread risk, which is how much is it going to impact me? Is it going to be something substantial? In order for us to see a big amplification of a small risk, it needs to score high both on risk of the unknown and high on dread risk, meaning it's something that might hurt us badly and it doesn't seem like people understand it very well. Here's an example of some things that, and this comes from their paper, that fit into these categories. So you'll see up there nuclear accidents. That's no surprise to you that that's something that we know a little bit about, but there's still some unknown nature to it, and they do have high dread risk. The subprime crisis from 2007, 2008, 2009 also falls into that category because the experts, the risk managers, the banks didn't seem to know what they were doing. And in that case, people started to lose faith. They started to lose confidence that their savings were going to be safe, their investments were going to be safe. And what was originally a couple $100 billion in losses became multiple trillions of dollars of loss. Now, more recently, the pandemic has gone through 3 phases. So when the pandemic started, we really didn't understand it well. We also saw that people were dying from it. We didn't know if this was going to be something with a 0.5% death rate or a 5% death rate. So there was a lot of uncertainty around that. So it had a high level of dread risk and a pretty good level of risk of the unknown. Early advice on how to deal with the pandemic wasn't very clear. It sometimes conflicted. There were people who were trying to undermine the experts who were telling us how to deal with this. And so that led to an increase in the risk of the unknown. So in the middle of the pandemic is when we saw the most amplification of risk, things like air traffic falling by 97%. It was extraordinary what happened. Now, since there have been vaccines that have been developed by experts, the level of knowledge or the risk of the unknown has fallen, the level of knowledge has increased, and our trust in experts, now that they're more aligned and we've seen that the vaccines have worked and that we've figured out ways to control it, now the pandemic is really into a place where maybe it's got as much or just slightly more potential impact than swimming pools or car accidents. We just don't think about it that much anymore. So now there's networks, the Kevin Bacon network that I showed you, that complex network I showed you at the very beginning. Our organizations have those, as I mentioned, and I like to refer to them as a social network because that's how information is exchanged. The different entities that appear on this screen are all part of this social network. The board of directors, again, people who I'm typically working with, investors, your executive leadership, everyone who is in this session today is part of their social network at the organization, which includes the Actuarial Society. Retirees have an influence on our organization. And you might look around this and say, well, regulators, what do they do? How are they part of this? I'm going to get to a second something called freedom capital. And freedom capital is something that's determined by everybody in this. Regulators and laws give us the freedom to pursue what we'd like to pursue. They can also take that away, but so can everybody else in this network. So that's something we're going to focus on in just a few minutes. So I'm a capital provider or I'm a capital demander. I'm going to be one of the two in these relationships. And this loop or the system of determining whether I want to be in this relationship begins with somebody saying, I need capital to do something. It might be an entrepreneurial startup. It might be a new product line in your business, or you're thinking about offering a new product line. You're going through a process of capital attraction. You're having to say, how do I convince somebody who is doing this value equation on my idea that it's something that's worth their capital and their allocation of capital? It's a whole story about risk. It's a story about prospective returns. It's setting up a case and a story that someone has to believe enough to invest in it. Could be your family, could be your friends, could be your credit card company, or if it's a larger organization, you're looking at much bigger levels of investment. So now when we get that capital, now we have to put it to use. And I like to refer to this as effective risk-taking because our organizations are always taking risks. That's why we exist. We're trying to fulfill some purpose. We're trying to find energy. We need to take risks to find that energy and to deliver and fulfill our purpose. So when we have fulfilled our purpose or when we have utilized the capital, we're going to give our first reward back to those who provided capital to us. This is feedback. Most of you are very familiar with feedback. You know, whether it's when we talk about dogs having a response when they hear a bell or see a treat, we have feedback that goes into our memory based on our experiences. And you might think this is really important. To a degree it is, but it's nowhere near as important as feed forward. And that's when we're going to get to this discussion of anticipated risk. Feed forward is the concept of discounting out the entire future of the relationship based on this notion of what do I expect to get, for how long do I expect to get it, and what's the chance that I'll be disappointed. Now, I may adjust the risk or the chance of being disappointed based on my feedback, but because this extends out so far in time, and because people tend to have higher negative reactions to loss or the potential for being disappointed, the impact of feed forward is multiples of feedback. And this is where actuaries and risk managers can have a huge influence on how successful our organizations are. Because ultimately, as a capital provider, I'm looking to get some reward. Ultimately, as a capital receiver or somebody trying to get capital, I'm looking to put it to use to fulfill my mission. If we've both done this well, we've created value for everyone in the loop, and the loop will continue. That's ideal. If we do this really well, the cost of capital continues to go down for us, particularly relative to other people doing the same thing we're doing, or other places that you could put capital to work. Now, when you talk about freedom, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these concepts of positive and negative freedom, but we're going to talk a little bit about them here. Positive freedom describes, in essence, your capacity. So you as an individual have positive freedom. You have your education. You have money in your bank account. You have your job. You might have a family. You might have a car. You might have all sorts of things that help you do what you want to do. The degree to which you have positive freedom gives you an ability to do things that you want to do. Not everybody has the same level of positive freedom. Negative freedom is a measure of the restrictions. How much of this positive freedom, in essence, is taken away from you by restrictions, whether they're laws, rules, or some things we're going to talk about in just a second, which aren't so explicit. So let's graphically look at this idea and try to understand why this is important for our organizations, to see our networks as living beings and our organizations as living beings, and how it influences our ability to put that capital to good use. So this represents our pure positive freedom. Now, our corporation has values and rules. We have expectations of what our boss thinks of us, what our board might think of us, maybe even some of the other people who are not as directly related to us. But what they think is okay to do is probably a subset of what we're able to do. Because if you've got a lot of positive freedom, you could do some things that maybe aren't that nice. So there is this first restriction on how you can use your positive freedom. But now there are laws and regulations, and those are set by this collective, right? So our collective of everybody who's part of some political construct sets these laws and regulations, and they probably have a high level of overlap with that from our corporation. At least we hope they do. Otherwise, our corporation might be deviating, but we've probably lost a little bit more of our positive freedom. Everybody in our network, all those people in that social network, all those entities in that social network that I mentioned to you, have different expectations about us, different rules, different things they'll tolerate, and some of those are quite diverse. Ultimately, when we bring all of these together and we look at everybody that's part of our network, we're not able to use all of our positive freedom, but we do have what I refer to as a nest or nested freedom. Within that nest, we have the freedom to do whatever we want to do, meaning all of these different capital providers have given us capital to allow us to try to achieve the goals of our organization in whatever way we want, as long as we don't go outside of this nest. Now, what happens if we do go outside of the nest? What happens if we disappoint people in these value equations, the feedback that comes to them, and it's not what they expected? Well, this is what we first looked at. That shrinks. And if we look at what's allowed by laws and regulations, that might shrink too, because the regulators are paying more attention to us. They put more rules on us, more reporting requirements. In fact, it could be that everyone in our social network reduces what they'll allow us to do. So now we have a much smaller portion of our positive freedom, our energy, that we could put to use. And that means we can't fulfill our goals as well, and it means we're less valuable. We could even have a breach of trust that's so egregious that all of our nested freedom goes away. In other words, we're put out of business. So if we do the opposite, if we increase trust, all of these nests expand, all of these restrictions expand, and we can be more effective at what we do. And this is where, at the very beginning, when I talked about trust being the most important part of our success, this is one way of illustrating that. So let's think about the environment we're in right now. Everything I'm trying to decide to do, with a partner, investing as an organization, long-term strategic planning, I have this massive list of things that are in flux. They're very difficult to deal with, whether they're financial, geopolitical, environmental, technological. changing expectations of generations, human capital availability, health, the pandemic, we talked about that. And then, of course, competition, which is always there for us. But sometimes competition seems like it's the seventh issue that we have to deal with. All of these interact with each other. So this makes for a very complex and difficult environment for us to operate in. Our work is more difficult too because generations are changing their expectations. Younger generations have higher expectations about the way in which their organizations operate in their communities. They have the ability to communicate their disapproval or approval more quickly than generations in the past. If Kevin Bacon made a bad movie back in the 1980s, it took a long time for people to hear about that. Today, you'll hear about it right away. And things go away quickly because these nests change based on what younger generations do with the technologies. There are diverging nests about technology standards, which I'm sure you're very aware of. Which standard do you choose when it comes to things like 5G? Do you choose a Chinese standard, an American standard? What are the consequences if you go with one technology over another? Are they geopolitical? Are they commercial? What consequences do you deal with? These are difficult decisions to make. And again, this fog of uncertainty is something that makes it very hard for us to meet the expectations of the people who are providing us with capital. How do we frame this out to this diverse set? Well, we'll get to that in just a second about how important it is that we communicate. But this challenge in understanding the future, this challenge in looking past all the complexities we have today, I'm not going to talk about that in the session today, but there are ways of dealing with it and working backwards, working back from a strategic planning standpoint on what the future might be and understanding how to structure organizations today to deal with what that future could be. But again, we have to recognize that we have these dependencies on these complex social networks. And one of the things that I would bet almost everybody on this call doesn't understand is every one of you has a different risk personality. The nice thing is there's an organization out in London of psychologists that put together a risk profiling thing called a risk compass. We work with people on that to help them understand their attitudes towards risk, as well as the attitudes towards risk in their team. And it's a really helpful tool for when you're trying to work in difficult times like this. So let's get back to this again, this value equation or this illustration that's on the left. What do I get? For how long will I get it? What's the chance I'm going to be disappointed? That's my anticipated risk. That's my feed forward mechanism in trying to decide whether I'm going to provide my capital to you, intellectual capital, my human capital, my financial capital, or this freedom capital that we talked about from the regulator's standpoint. That discount rate is a function of the perception, what my brain thinks is going to be the future of working with your organization or with you. So how do we signal trust? If trust is the most important thing that we can communicate out, feedback, right? That's what I mentioned. That's part of that process, is that I had an expectation. Did you meet that expectation? What's your track record for meeting expectations? Now we get into the more important parts. Feed forward, transparency. I think that the last speaker talked about transparency around climate risks, about what you're doing at your organization to deal with climate risks. Can we, as a board or as an organization, communicate the way in which we do or don't understand our risks? Can we communicate the way in which we do or don't innovate? Can we communicate that we understand that we have the resources needed to deal with the complexity of the business model that we have? Do we have experts like actuaries? Do we have risk management experts? Do we have experts that can help us in geopolitics? How do we get in that knowledge, the social amplification framework, to where people trust that we have the knowledge, which eliminates or greatly reduces the possibility of fleeing capital from us, this amplification, creditworthiness, making sure that we're capitalized to a level that gives people confidence that we're going to be around for a long period of time. Continuously innovating, bringing in new knowledge. This helps with feedback because we get a better reward, and feed forward because people start to look at us and say, oh, that organization is doing interesting things. I'm sure each of you could name 3 or 4 companies that you think of as always bringing interesting things to you, interesting products, interesting ideas. And being able to respond to things that we don't expect. That's a good part of a risk management program. So I talk in the first book that I wrote, and I think it might be mentioned in the second book as well, this notion of a networked and distributive governance model. The whole notion of this is to try and push risk management out to a place as close to where risk is being originated. So the model of the old business where there was a CEO that was in charge and an executive suite that made all the decisions and everybody else just carried out their orders, that's really flipped. There's guardrails that are set up, there are objectives set up, but what we try to do is give people the power to make decisions about innovation and dealing with the things that they didn't expect. And then importantly, and this kind of gets to those risk personality conversations, look at ourselves. Are we diverse enough? Do we think about problems in ways that are different from each other? Or are we all from the same school, same background, same education, same approach to things? If so, we've got some risk in our own teams. So how do you improve this? Recognize your stakeholders, determine that cost of capital for you, and treat them well. Understand how complex systems can collapse, meaning those nests go away because we violated the trust people had in us. We want to create a form of governance and risk-taking that creates trust inside of the organization as well. And will this decision build trust should be asked about every single thing you do. Does this build trust among your colleagues, clients, capital providers, whoever they might be? And let's make sure we communicate with them effectively. So I'm going to jump quickly to the goals, and then we might have a few minutes still for questions. Understand that our organizations are living entities. They don't have a heart, but they have multiple brains, and they act like living beings. They have the function of living beings. They are complex systems that depend on all sorts of other complex systems. We can't get away from those dependencies. So it's best for us to invite them in this knowledge building loop, get their feedback, get their ideas, bring them in through stakeholder groups, however you might do it at a board level, but use that dependency. They want us to succeed. They depend on us to succeed, or they hope that we will. And then come to know that fulfilling their expectations, fulfilling the things that they have built into their feed-forward assessment of working with us builds trust. And the influence of trust, like I talked about before in terms of the denominator of that value equation, that feed forward is multiple times more important than the feedback. So with that, I know the slide deck will be shared with you very quickly. I'll just put up my contact information, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And then you'll have my contact details in the slides as well. So Sanchit, I hope that was something that's helpful, but I'm happy to answer any questions that might be out there.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I am just waiting to see if there are questions. I haven't actually seen any in the chat box on the Q&A, but if
maybe everybody's heard me before.
I'm sure there are a few who are new to the concepts.
And I would assume, Sanchit, maybe if people are going to write things in, but this notion of the psychology of risk, is that something that you find to be discussed often with actuaries, or is it outside of the conversation?
I mean, certainly in the risk management concept, it's become, and certainly working in the risk function, we find that that's incredibly important. It's also important in all sorts of areas like compliance, for example, and you're looking at how functions respond to compliance requirements or policy requirements, and a lot of times it is that perception or it is that attitude towards behaviors or towards risk. And while you were speaking, I was reminded of Michelle Walker's book, You Are What You Risk.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's another one which I found interesting to read. So I'd recommend that to colleagues.
And in Michelle's book, she mentions that risk compass as well. Those risk personalities that I was talking about, and we're seeing more pickup in that. It's, I think, an incredibly helpful tool for helping boards or C-suites or any team working together to communicate better with each other. When you understand the person across the table from you is a risk-loving person or an adventurous person or somebody who is very control-oriented, it helps you frame the way in which you talk to each other, so there's less conflict. And Sanchit, I know we're coming up against the end of the time, but if there is another question, I'm happy to answer it, or if there is a question, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, people can reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to meet with them or answer questions by email. Hi, Sean.
Hi, David. Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. I sent a question to the group. I really impressed by your talk on your presentation on feed-forward loop, how that will create value. I'm just wondering, as actuaries, also in the context of insurance regulation, my question is, can we actually quantify such multiple?
Yeah, so in that value equation, it actually comes out of the math that was done to value mortgage-backed securities. So that's where the idea originated with me way back when. Now, there's always going to be some variation in this because we're trying to model an inefficient exercise. So there's assumption about what this exercise curve looks like. But we can build out discount rates using, market rates to come up with some estimate of what the zero curve is or what the risk-free curve is. We get a little bit more into the subjective nature when we're starting to tag on risk premium, and so what we add on top of that. But I was at a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and it was an engineer who was talking about valuing investments in dealing with climate risk. So kind of relating back to the presentation that was before mine. And he talked about the massive uncertainty about climate impact out in the future. And then when one of the finance professors who was at the event asked him, well, how did you come up with the value today to determine that such and such was a good idea? He said, oh, we just applied a 4% discount rate. And completely ignored this idea that this future that he had just talked about, which was so incredibly uncertain, he was giving it the same discount rate as tomorrow or as today. And so I think, there's an art and a science to it. But there are models, in financial variables, certainly, or financial models, certainly, to come up with these valuations. But really, when we get into the human side of it, all we know is this is what's going to trigger somebody's response. This is what their expectations are. We have a general sense for what their way of exercising real option is, but there's a lot of art to it. But we know that if we work on transparency, trust building, open communication, engaging them, it's more likely that they're not going to have a big shift up in that risk premium that they put on us. And that's, I think, one of the most important things for the survival of our organizations. If our cost of capital jumps dramatically because we've failed, that's when we're in danger.
Oh, thank you, David. On personal note for the audience, I think I met David, but more than 20 years ago in
It's a long time ago. It was nice to see your name up there.
I'm so impressed. You kept young with young mind, still innovating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Sean. I was happy to see your name on there, and I think I must have some filter on if I still look young.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sean, for that question, and David. Afraid we're up on time, so I will